Welcome. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Athabasca University Writer-in-Residence talk with Bertrand Bickersteth. My name is Dr. Paul Hubener. I'm a professor of English here at AU, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you here today on behalf of the Writer-in-Residence Committee. Athabasca University is located on the traditional territory of the Cree and the Métis. And because we are an online university, our employees and students live and work on many other traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. I know that's true for many of you joining us today, and some of you might be in other places around the world too. Please feel free to acknowledge your location in the chat if that works for you. But we're delighted to have you here. We've been looking forward to this. Our Writer-in-Residence program is funded by the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here at AU and by the Canada Council for the Arts, for which we are incredibly thankful. Our thanks as well to Joanna Manchur and University Relations for promoting this event. And also joining us today is Dr. Manijay Manani, the Dean of FHSS, and I think Manijay is going to say a few words. Please go ahead, Manijay.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the introduction. Paul, as Paul mentioned, my name, for those of you who don't know me, is Manijay Manani, and I am the Dean in the faculty. I'm joining our webinar here today from Treaty 6 territory here in Southwest Edmonton. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our 2024-25 Writer-in-Residence, Bertrand Bickersteth. It's wonderful to have you here with us this year and the next, and to be here today to listen to your talk. I also want to take this opportunity and to thank the members of the Writer-in-Residence Committee, Angie Abdu, Chair of the committee, Jolene Armstrong, David Buchanan, Adine Dubabwer, Paul Hubener, and Mark McCutcheon. So this committee, I've served on it myself, is a fun committee to be on, but it involves a lot of work, a lot of preparation, thinking, planning, and I'm very grateful to each and every single member of the committee. And I'm sure you've worked, many of you, but more specifically you, Mark, and Paul and Angie, with Bertrand, for the applications, primarily Paul, that resulted in a successful one with the CCA. In any case, that's it for me. I will turn it over to you, Paul, or Mark, I don't know who, and then looking forward to the presentation. To you, Mark, back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean Manani. I'm pleased to sort of chime in on this introduction of what, by my count, this is our 14th Writer-in-Residence. So I don't know if there's a traditional anniversary gift for the Writer-in-Residence when we come to the 14th year, but I do suspect paper will be involved. So, or at least I hope so. But housed in the Center for Humanities, which is in turn housed in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science that Dean Manani heads up, the Writer-in-Residence program is a very special sort of jewel in the crown of what we do. It affords the Athabasca University community and indeed the wider public to access creative professionals, professional writers, acclaimed writers who are writing, working, and publishing in Canada. The program thus furthers the university's mission to open access to education. Anybody in the university community is welcome to contact the Writer-in-Residence with draft work for feedback and critique. Please do see the website for guidelines about what is expected that way. The submission guidelines do have some specifics worth noting. We've hosted, luminaries. We've hosted decorated writers like Hiromi Goto, Catherine Vermette, Essie Adigian, Christian Bach. We've hosted writers who have worked on things that, since they were working on during their time with us, went on to accolades and awards like John Valence Fire Weather. And I've always really welcomed the opportunity to pick the brains of these dazzlingly creative and inventive writers and cultural workers, and to hear more generally where they're at and what they're working on in these talks. I always take notes that I continue to come back to years after, and this is a really special series. So I'd like to bounce things back now to my colleague Paul to introduce our writer. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark and Manajay. And just to mention, we also have a giveaway today. One of our guests will be randomly selected to win copies of all 3 books in the new AU Press Writing in Residence book series. These books showcase the work of our previous writers in residence. So big thanks to AU Press and University Relations for the giveaway. If you're the winner, you'll hear from us. But for everybody here, AU Press is an open access press. So the ebooks that they publish are free, and we've put a link in the chat for that. Now, Bertrand is with us from now until June, and he's available to give feedback and advice to any AU students who are working on creative writing projects. So if you're an AU student and you're writing a novel or poetry, you can send your writing to Bertrand and have the chance to get some feedback from him. Bertrand was born in Sierra Leone and raised in Alberta. And when he's not our writer in residence, he teaches at Olds College on Treaty 7 land in Alberta, north of Calgary. His poetry collection, The Response of Weeds, has received multiple awards, and his writing has appeared in many publications such as Prairie Fire, The Walrus, and CBC's Black on the Prairies. And he's currently writing poetry about Black cowboys in Western Canada in the early 20th century. And I believe he will be telling us about that today. So welcome, Bertrand. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Virtual clapping. Yeah, I love it. Thank you for that introduction. I have to thank Paul for doing very much for me. Paul's my main contact in this role, and you've done so much. I really appreciate it. You helped to set this up as well. I do deeply appreciate that. I also wanted to thank Joanna Mencher, who has also been very helpful with promotion and marketing and such. I would be remiss if I didn't thank Manijay Manani, the Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, for just being so welcoming and gracious. And I deeply appreciate that. And of course, it's a thrill to be occupying this role and to be interacting with your students. It is very unique that we have a kind of version of the Open University here in Canada, and Athabasca University has been doing this for a long time. I have appreciated being in contact with students from all over the country, from all over the country, and engaging their work. And I encourage you, if you are one of those students who would like to reach out, please do. It's not scary at all. It's fun, actually. I am coming to you from Calgary, or what was traditionally called Mohkinstsis. This is Treaty 7. It's Blackfoot Confederacy territory, traditional territories. Blackfoot Confederacy consisting of the Siksika, the Ganai, the Piikani, as well as the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda, who comprise the Chiniki, the Goodstoney, and Bears Paw First Nations. I want to just very quickly mention that one of those nations, the Kainai, who used to be called the Blood Nations, they feature somewhat in my talk today, very, very briefly, but I just wanted to acknowledge that along with all of these peoples who were the original stewards of the land, who then encountered the settlers who came and then transformed in devastating and drastic ways their livelihood, as well as the various immigrants who came from all quarters within the group, within the groups of people who were settlers as well as the immigrants, are Black peoples whose histories often are intertwined with Indigenous peoples in this land. And one of the groups, one of the nations that I mentioned, the Kainai, have a connection in my talk, but it's a very brief one. So I wanted to take advantage of just alerting you to that now, so that when you get to it, you see that these historical interactions are not simple in any way. All right, I'm going to share my screen with you folks now, and then I'll get us started. Ooh, which one? I think it's this guy here. And hopefully I'll be able to see. Oh, I'm still just seeing Paul's screen up there for some reason.
That looks good. That looks good.
It looks good?
You're good. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's so weird. I can't see it at all. Okay, so is it doing the side-by-side thing, Paul?
I'm seeing the full screen slideshow presentation, and then I see a small live image of you at the top row of participants.
Yep,
Oh,
same.
okay.
That looks good.
Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's fine. I'll just leave it at that.
Looks great.
Right? Yeah, let's go with that. Excellent.
Very,
okay.
Very professional.
You know what? We're all professionals here, so of course it is, right? Okay, so I'm going to be talking about black cowboys, but to start us off, what I would like to do is give you a little bit of a kind of entree to the whole thing. I call this making sense of nonsense, and I want to focus on a time in my life where I was living in the UK. And those of you who have lived in other countries, you know this phenomenon, where there's always a period in which you have to kind of overcome what feels like nonsense to you because it makes no sense at all. But for everyone else, it's just normal, right? And so you have to absorb it and learn it. Eventually, it does make sense. I was fortunate in that my son was born while we were in the UK. And so I had a whole set of new words, new language associated with being a new parent that I didn't have words for before. And so I gained a kind of insider experience in the UK. For example, my son wore nappies and not diapers. He had a nipple instead of a soother. We pushed him in a push chair rather than a stroller, et cetera, right? And as he got older, I was immersed in things like Teletubbies and Thomas the Tank Engine and nursery rhymes that I'd never heard before, like the Grand Old Duke of York. Yeah. So up on the screen here, I've got that nursery rhyme. And normally I'd go through these lyrics because I want you to see how nonsense it is. Like, it's nonsensical of the highest notion. It's so nonsensical, it makes perfect sense. It's that kind of nonsense. All right. But the point that I want to give to you here is that I actually had a very unexpected encounter through the Duke of York. And that is, although it was utterly new to me, and this is a very common nursery rhyme in the UK. I know some of us have it here as well, and many of you probably have heard it, but it's extremely common in the UK. They even had a hit song that they made of it in the 90s. So everyone knows it, like Mary Had a Little Lamb here. They all know it. So I was encountering it all the time, and I was struck by how strange it was and different, but I was also struck by the fact that it also seemed familiar to me. And I don't mean familiar in a casual way, but familiar in an intimate way, like I knew it. In fact, I will say that I was experiencing that a lot while we were in the UK. Now, the reason for that actually isn't all that mysterious, and I don't have time to build up the drama in the way I might in a classroom, okay? The reason for that is quite simple. These things actually were familiar to me. I had very logically inherited them through my parents, who themselves had been raised in colonial Sierra Leone. And so their points of reference were Britain. They were English. And when I was growing up in Alberta, when I was the same age as my son in England, singing the Grand Old Duke of York to him, they were doing these things to me when I was very young. The difference was I was not surrounded by people who also accepted those things as normal, and already being identified as different racially, I immediately jettisoned anything that my parents gave me that registered as nonsense amongst my peers and the rest of the world around me. So I had evacuated all these things from my mind without even knowing it. And when we went back to the UK, I was suddenly encountering all of these things again and realizing that, oh, what I thought was my parents' weirdness was actually just England. That's all it was. So that was very striking to me because in the end, I had a feeling of belonging in the UK that I never experienced when I was in Alberta. That is a kind of nonsense I never expected to have. It's certainly a kind of sense from nonsense that I never expected to make. But there you have it. The Albertan didn't work in Alberta. The Duke of York worked in England. All right. So I did derive this sense of belonging from nonsense through the grand old Duke of York. If any of you had a chance to read the lyrics, you'll see what I meant. Okay. It's nonsensical and sensical at the same time. I think that's how nursery rhymes work, though. All right. I want to now bring us back from the UK to Alberta, and I want to share with you two passages from this text by Grant McEwen on John Ware. Many of you may know of John Ware already. He is our most famous cowboy. He is probably in Alberta, certainly the first touchstone when we talk about Black history. We go back to John Ware. And if you haven't heard of him, that's okay. That's what this talk is for. All right. I call him the most famous unknown person that we have. Because even here in Alberta, there are many people most people, in fact, who have never heard of John Ware, even though he forms this important part of our history. Grant McEwen wrote this biography on him precisely because he wanted to enter John Ware into the history of the West. Grant McEwen wrote a lot of books on the West, and in part is responsible for our historical sense of the Western lore that is part of our identity. But for him, John Ware represented one of those many people who came from a motley of varieties of peoples who all came together to help to form this province. So one of the elements to all these people coming together was a disdain for things like titles. And in the text, Grant McEwen has John Ware talking to some people from England who were acting all highfalutin but couldn't ride horses and were falling all over, and many comical scenes by Grant McEwen standards. He was telling these English people that, if you're going to come to the West, you have to realize there is no place for titles like earls or dukes or lords. No place. That just doesn't fly here. All right. On the very next page, Grant McEwen presents us with a scene in which John Ware encounters another Black person in Alberta, a young boy, a stable boy. His name is Sam. And Grant McEwen represents John Ware as being shocked by the sight of another Black person. And the words that he uses, I've quoted here for you, are, "You're sure a long way from home. You're a long way from home." Now I'm giving you these two passages, and they actually happen one page after the other. It's very interesting because I think that what Grant McEwen is helping to show us here, and not intentionally, I don't think, but what we can seize upon is this paradox of Black belonging on the prairies. Because in the first example, what we see is as a cowboy in Alberta, not a duke or a lord or an earl, but as a cowboy in Alberta, John Ware is at home. Indeed, this is why Grant McEwen is writing this biography on him. He's worthy of this subject. He's one of us. Okay, so as a cowboy in Alberta, John Ware is at home. As a Black person in Alberta, he is far from home. "You're sure far from home," he says from his own lips. Yeah. This to me feels like an important paradox to consider when it comes to Black belonging on the prairies. But also it gives us a way into thinking about Black cowboys. Because if you're at home as a cowboy, but you're not at home or you're far from home as a Black person, what does that make you as a Black cowboy? Now, before I move on to the next part, I just want to very quickly give a plug to my friend Cheryl Fogo. This image here that you see comes from her movie on John Ware. So those of you who don't know anything about him and want to go check out information on him, there is a documentary available free through the NFB. You can go and watch it. And this is a scene from it that I've stolen. All right. So what of Black cowboys? Okay, you can be at home as a cowboy, but never or far from home as a black person, what are black cowboys? Let's talk about black cowboys, all right? So my Duke of York analogy is leading us to focus on black cowboys. I'm going to be talking about them very briefly, and then after that, I want to share with you some challenges in researching black cowboys. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some examples of the fruits of the labor of research that I've done. And then we'll see what we have left over for time, since I notoriously usually come up with about, I don't know, 30 or 40 slides, too many, in all of my presentations. So we'll see how far we get. All right, let's start with black cowboys in Canada. All right. In order for us to engage this, really, we need to start with black cowboys in the US, because that is how the history works. All right. So why is it that we have never heard of black cowboys in Canada? Well, it's because most people had never heard of black cowboys in the US. And that's because the image of the West as it was produced was very strongly tied to white people. Here's a quote from famous actor John Wayne. If there are any young students out there, I'm very sorry. He was just super famous, had a really slow, funny way of talking. What else can I say? Okay. Iconic representative of what they considered the West back then. Okay. He says that every country in the world loved the folklore of the West, the music, the dress, the excitement, everything that was associated with the opening of a new territory. So clearly for him, the West is this place of opportunity and excitement, but it wasn't obviously for everyone, right? Because for Indigenous people and for Black people, it was not. In fact, both of these peoples were being extirpated from the West, from our perception of the West anyway. Black cowboys were being written out of it. Indigenous peoples were essentially being destroyed from it. And so the path was being established for making a kind of natural connection between whiteness and the West. I have in the right column there some reasons for, or some of the elements that contributed to the whitening of the West. Again, we don't have time to go into these things in great detail, but I will just point out the top one is in bold because we are going to come back to it, and it's one that's salient to my project. So first of all, historians didn't really pay attention to Black people on the Western frontier. Just didn't. Either diminished their presence, dismissed them, or simply ignored them. So we don't really have them in historical accounts very much, not to the extent that we should, certainly. The popular literature at the time also omitted Black people. If they represented Black people, they're usually slaves or servants, but never cowboys. And here, let me just quickly give you a quick timeline of the cowboy period, just so you get an understanding of this. When we're talking about cowboys, we're largely talking the 19th century. All right. The heyday in the US is the middle of the 19th century, kind of peaking at the third quarters, 1870s, and then by the 20th century, it's really petering out at that point. And there are a couple reasons for that that I will mention later on. But the point is, by the 1900s, we're starting to move into a new era. All right. And so early 20th century literature is already looking back on an era that's coming to an end, if not over. All right. So the popular dime novels at the time, that was like pulp fiction basically at the time, just didn't include Black people, right? Early Western films framed the West as white. And then very interestingly, even folk music collectors, and I did want to stop on this point because John Wayne does point to music. He says the music and the dress is exciting, right? So this is a part of the construction of the West. Folk music collectors actually established racialized categories which segregated the groups. It's so interesting. The Lomaxes, which several of you are probably familiar with, they went out and they just gathered what to them was rural folk music. That's all it was. Had similar origins, but when they marketed it, they would market some as hillbilly music, got marketed to white people, and some as race songs or race music. Okay, and that was representative of Black music. But interestingly, in the earliest recordings of these forms of music, They even had the same players, musicians, playing on the same albums that were going out to hillbilly or to a race as race songs. So they all came from the same origin, but in marketing, they separated them out. All right. In other words, black got segregated out from country, essentially, as hillbilly music morphs, eventually into country and Western. And then race music, race songs morphs into the blues eventually. All right. So what this means is by the middle of the 20th century, the connection between whiteness and the West is a done deal. It's done. People just accept it and think that it is utterly natural. Another little Easter egg for us here, another famous quote unquote cowboy. Again, I mean, I hope we all know who this is, but I know I get older and older. So if there are students out there, you may not know, but this was the 40th president of the United States. Also known for being an actor as well. And he was a cowboy as an actor, kind of a John Wayne Jr., right? He wasn't quite John Wayne, but he also lived a cowboy lifestyle. He loved it. He had a ranch in California and he loved it. All right. Ronald Reagan, if you weren't familiar with him, but I'm hoping we all were, right? I'm not that old. Yeah. Anyway, everyone thinks the cowboys are white by now. And it's not until the 1970s that academically we actually get a serious treatment of black cowboys. And here we get a couple of texts by one from, what's his name? Kenneth Porter puts one out. And William Lawrence Katz puts another one out. All right. I think Black West is Lawrence Katz text. And these texts are dated at this point, certainly, but they're pioneering as well. It's their first real academic treatment we get of black cowboys. And this is 1971. So really, we're talking, between 50 and 70 years almost after that actual lifestyle came to an end. All right. And then slowly after that, more people get interested in it. And now in the 21st century, finally, we have a coterie of academics who are actually looking at black cowboys. So the fact is, even though we didn't know it, there always have been black cowboys. There even are today, in fact, still. In Kenneth Porter's text, he estimates that out of roughly 35,000 cowboys, and it gets tricky to count them because how you define a cowboy also gets tricky. But I'll give you two criteria in a moment. Out of 35,000, he estimates between 6,000 and 9,000 were black. Okay, and that's somewhere between a quarter and a fifth of all cowboys. That's a significant number. All right. So that means wherever there were cowboys, there were probably black cowboys there as well. Another connection is the theory that is out there that the word cowboy also demonstrates connections to the history of slavery and enslaved Africans. This is because there were actually many terms that were used, and even today are still used, to describe people who worked with cattle. Ranchers, ranch hands, cowpokes, cowboys as well. But the word boy was generally reserved for black men, regardless of whether they were 60 or 70 or 80, if they had decades worth of expertise or knowledge or mastery of anything. If they were black and they were men, they were boys. So anyone doing any kind of labor, and of course, during slavery, so before 1865, if you had to do labor and your labor involved ranching or cowboys or something like that, then very likely you're going to have someone who's enslaved doing labor for you. Hence, cowboy. This slide here simply gives you the variety of figures of black cowboys that were out there in history that had to be recovered for us now to go out and to research more thoroughly. I won't spend time here because there's so much to go over here, but I do want to point out if you can see their birth and death dates, you'll see that they line up with the period of cowboy activity, and many of them are quite early on, so pre-1865. And so this indicates, although doesn't guarantee, but it indicates that they were likely working as enslaved laborers in the cattle industry. And that should remind us that, of course, there were people who were Black who were working as cowboys, because if you had slaves, you made them do this stuff. I can't help myself. I have to add one more thing on this slide. Bass Reeves, who's this character right down here, the second from the top, he was actually a deputy marshal in Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma today. And he is very likely the inspiration, the original inspiration for the figure of the Lone Ranger. So right there, we have an example of literal whitewashing taking place right there, because he doesn't look like the Lone Ranger that we know. Couldn't help myself with that one. Okay, so I mentioned that there are a couple of ways of defining cowboys, or rather, there are a couple of criteria you can use to identify cowboys. One of them is rounding up. Those are tasks that cowboys have to do twice a year, usually traditionally. They would have to go round up cattle, because back in the day, there were no fences and we just let our cattle roam free. And so you had to round them up. Usually in the spring, you would do it once. And then HBO series, that's true. I watched Watchmen. I forgot about that. Yeah. You usually in the spring, you would round them up because it was after calving took place. And so now you had to count some more calves that you had and brand them usually. And in the fall, when you then ship them off to the cattle markets. Okay, so roundup was one task that definitely cowboys did. And then shipping them off to the cattle markets involved walking them along trails to the points that they could then transmit them or transfer them to the actual physical markets. So here you can see some of the traditional cattle trails. In this case, they're all starting in Texas, and most of them did, or many of them, I should say, did. And they go very far north, right up into Nebraska and even Wyoming, as you can see. This next slide, though, shows how they would connect with the railway lines that then would move them off to the bigger centers like Chicago, most famously, which is where the main stockyard was, and then distributed to the rest of the country. These rail lines are an indication of another reason why or rather a reason why the livelihood of cowboying kind of came to an end in the 20th century, because they were limited then, but after a while, trains went everywhere, and so you no longer had to drive your cattle along a trail to be shipped through from trail to rail. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, you no longer had to do it in that way. These trails didn't stop, though, in the United States. They carried on into Canada as well. Not directly necessarily, so you didn't necessarily start in Texas and then literally walk all the way up to Canada, but sometimes you did. But ranches along the way and different herds along the way would kind of join up and join and end at different parts. But the point is, there were connections between these historic trails and Canada. And so therefore, cattlemen did move up into Canada. During the era when it was starting to fade in the US, it was peaking or starting to peak in Canada. And so a lot of them just moved into the US. And where there were these cattlemen coming up the cattle trails, there were cowboys. And where there were cowboys, as you now know, at least 1 out of 4 was Black. So Black cowboys came up to Canada as well, and that's why we can now look back in history and identify somebody like a John Ware, okay, who is easily the most famous Black cowboy we have. And for that reason, I'm not going to spend more time on this slide other than to point out to you that his lovely wife there, Mildred, was not from cowboy extraction. She came from the city. She came from Ontario. Her entire family did. And so she had to learn the life. It wasn't easy for her. And that down here, my third bullet point, John Ware worked at Bayou Ranch. It's a famous ranch that the Northwest Cattle Company started up. And many cowboys who came up from the US worked there, including John Ware and this next guy here, Green Walters, who's not as well known, but is starting to become known, I say with pleasure. Now, Green Walters is not quite a cowboy in the same way as John Ware. John Ware is a classic cowboy. He did roundups, he did cattle trailing, classic. Green Walters is kind of cowboy adjacent, I call him. He makes it up to to Canada through the U.S. through the Idaho Trail. So he was at a ranch in Lemhi County. He was a hay contractor while he was there. He makes it up into Alberta in 1881. You know, I'm actually second guessing myself on this one. I'm kind of doubting myself, but this is what my notes at 1881. If this is the case, then he might have been in Canada before John Ware. So I have to actually go back and double check that, but that's what my notes said anyway. 1881, and he does multiple things. So he was kind of like the cowboy support crew. He worked as a cook, so he would cook for the crew when they were out doing roundups or out on the trail. He was a general laborer, of course, a general ranch hand and that sort of thing, but he was certainly comfortable around horses. He knew that life, absolutely, to the extent where he started his own very small ranch and significantly for me has a cattle brand. Because as you will see in this next slide here, there are lots of cowboys, actually, lots of cowboys that we can name who were working here in Alberta at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, but we just don't have more than snippets of information about them. It's just very, very difficult to find a lot of details. And my project is trying to find cattle brands. And so many of these folks, it's virtually impossible for me to find much more than the fact that they were a cowboy and they worked here at a certain time. But there you have it. That's probably more names than most of you ever imagined were Black cowboys here in Canada. And that should tell us that there are probably many more that simply went unrecorded. Yeah. 1 in 4 is our general stat, right? So probably many more. Maybe it wasn't 1 in 4 here in Canada, but certainly more than the handful that I have up here on my screen. If you expand the definition beyond simply those who were involved in trailing and in rounding up, you actually increase the number quite a bit. That's why she's so shocked there, right? She can't believe this. And my list of people here are very significant to my research because, as I told you, I'm trying to uncover cattle brands by, yeah, look at her, by Black cowboys. All of these people here listed here have recorded cattle brands. They all have cattle brands in different, yes, I know. Very, very intriguing, both of them. I'm so sorry we don't have time to talk about them specifically now, but maybe afterwards we'll be able to sit down and have a chat about some of those names. But yes, if we expand that world, we see there are many more people, and these are the people that interest me. We'll come back to the first name on this list later on. In the interest of time, I'm going to move us forward, though. All right. So, yes, there were Black cowboys in Canada. Lots. All right, there were. Let's talk a little bit about researching Black history in general, as well as Black cowboys, because, folks, it is not easy. It's not. And I just noticed, actually, that Karina Vernon is here. Karina can speak to this as well, all right? It is massively difficult to try to recover this history that has been covered over, dismissed, ignored, and sometimes even destroyed. Very, very difficult. I'm only going to just draw out two reasons two challenges that I faced in trying to uncover these brands. There are many more, and there's many more to both of these reasons. Again, I probably have 35 too many slides, okay? And so just know that the nature of the sources themselves create a challenge, and then the impact of doing this research also is a very important challenge. It doesn't get talked about enough, and so I do want to talk about it. The sources are difficult for many reasons, but as you can guess, because way back on slide 9 or whatever, I told you that this one of the reasons of the 4 pillars of erasing Blackness from the Western imaginations, want to come back to this, historians diminished, dismissed, and ignored their presence. That means that now when we go to do history, there's far less of it available than there is for somebody who's doing research on Margaret Atwood or George Washington or William Shakespeare, right? They don't have those kinds of difficulties. We have to go to archives. We have to look through old newspapers. We have to find snippets of things and then hope in a reference here and a reference there and a reference there, we can draw a kind of triangulated fact from all of that. It's very, very difficult, very, very time consuming. Okay. Lots more I could say about that, but you get the picture, I think. I do want to spend some time talking about the impact of this research as well, because we don't talk about this enough. And I honestly think this is a serious thing. Another figure I just threw up there. I guess I have a few Easter eggs in this. I can't help it. So James Baldwin doesn't have anything to do with black cowboys that I know about. All right, but he's enormously important to me and my development as an intellect and as a researcher. And so I throw him in there wherever I can. But I think that he does actually speak on a level to this, and he would certainly empathize with this. When you do this kind of research, yes, there are happy discoveries. I just a couple weeks ago found a couple more cattle brands. These ones are not Canadian ones, they're American ones, but who's doing research on black cattle brands in the US? Not a lot of people, so I'm thrilled to have found those. So there are happy discoveries. But at the same time, there are also these constant re-encounters with the stories of racism that these people went through. You get this reaffirmation of white supremacy and its long-standing presence as well. And I got to tell you, this even just happened to be just 3 nights ago. I was reading through a very random document, 1910, this document was. And folks, back then, white people didn't even think white supremacy was bad. They thought it was good. They wanted it. And in this document I read, it said, I mean, I don't have time to give you the whole thing, but it was about the boxing match between Jeffries and Johnson, Jack Johnson, the great boxer who was the heavyweight world champion in 1910. And it said, look, folks, we got to make sure that Jeffries wins because that will be a symbol of white supremacy. And I see many ways in which white supremacy is being challenged, and we have to make sure that white supremacy stays the order of things today. And this is just a random article in a random newspaper from 1910. This is not some political diatribe or some polemicist or somebody who is propagandizing or anything like that. This was just a regular perspective. Okay, it was an average perspective. So it does get disheartening and it does get exhausting to encounter this sort of thing again and again. And often I find myself reading the stories of these people in the 1890s and the 1900s, and I think to myself, my goodness, I went through that, for crying out loud. Has anything even changed? And that has a toll. It takes an emotional toll. And I know this is not a thing we do regularly talk about in research, but I think it is worthy of paying attention to. It's worthy of acknowledgement. So that is another challenge in doing this research, because sometimes you just don't even want to turn the page, believe it or not, sometimes. All right. But the value of what you do recover is worth it. Okay. And that is why we do this sort of thing. And what I have been recovering is the lost language of cowboys. I see it's 3:43 now. I'm thinking that means I have maybe 2 minutes. Is that right, Paul? If
I think
that's
we've got
right,
some flexibility, Bertrand. It would be great to allow some questions, but we love hearing from you.
Okay, so let's call it 2-ish minutes, 2 to 10 minutes. Let's say something like that. Okay, so let's talk about the lost language of cowboys and what that is exactly. This is what I'm here calling the poetry of forgery, okay, for a couple of reasons that you'll see. So what is this lost language? Yeah. Well, you remember the list that I showed you way back here of all these people? It's the list of people, of Black people who actually have cattle brands. And for me, this is a particular kind of imaginative expression that is true to this area here, that's expressive of this area, that has not really been looked at very closely. So I'm very happy to do this kind of research. Remember the first name on the list, Charles Dyson? He was a blacksmith. Okay, he was a blacksmith. He also happened to be a rancher himself. Okay, so he was a rancher. And this to me suggests that as a blacksmith and a rancher, he probably forged his own tools, including his own branding iron. To me, this is very significant because it feels as though the person who creates their own branding iron is getting involved in a kind of expression, which to me is poetic. You may not agree, but in a kind of expression that is imaginative, that is literary, that is creative, that is made by his own hand. And that to me is very significant. Here is his cattle brand from 1900 in the 1900 Alberta brand book. It's actually tricky to not to identify them. How you name brands is actually tricky. So this is how you read them. Okay, this is just a quick primer on that. Generally, you read them from outside to inside, top to bottom, left to right. Most brands, left to right is good enough. But sometimes, in the case of this one here, bar U, remember the bar U branch? It's a bar on top, so we read that first. And then the U comes underneath, left to right. There's nothing right of the left of the U. And so we would read this as a bar U, okay? Not U bar or anything like that. Bar U, all right? So in the case of Charles Dyson's, maybe we could call this bar 1, bar 2, maybe, okay? Or it might be bar over 1, bar 2, something like that. Those of you who actually know how to read brands, you can correct me. You can give the a more correct reading of that. But essentially what I'm trying to share with you is that you can do much more than just bar things with cattle brands. You can reverse them, tumble them, lazy them, all kinds of things, which really does produce in the end a kind of language of expression. This one over here, I don't know if you can see my pointer. I hope you can. Near the top, the B, that's attached to a quarter circle, and it's kind of a lazy B. It's hanging down. This is a rocking B. Okay, it's a rocking B. And you can do that with all of these letters. And people who know brands far better than I do can tell you whole stories with these brands. They're amazing. That's why I call Dyson a poet. That's why, to me, I feel as though he is actually engaging in a kind of language. He invented that symbol, and then he created it, and then he registered it in the brand book. So he's my Black Hephaestus, okay? He's, excuse me, my Black Vulcan. Here are some examples of brands. This is John Ware's brand. It's the 4 9s, which became 3 9s, or sometimes we call them walking sticks as well. Very famous. I don't need to talk about it. It's actually still out there today. Here's Green Walter's brand, which to me is another form of poetry here. I've actually written about this as well elsewhere. This is known as the double ox yoke brand. As you can see, it's 2 yokes that are connected. Okay, so you might call it a connected double ox yoke, but a double ox yoke. And for me, this is poetry because you can't help but connect that language, the yoke, to imagery of slavery. And indeed, in the 19th century, it was very common to associate the word yoke with slavery. People took it from the Bible, where Paul's letters to the Galatians refer to under the yoke of slavery. Frederick Douglass, a very famous Black abolitionist in the 19th century, talks about bearing up under the yoke of slavery, and so on and so forth. All right. On the right, you see an image of an actual double yoke that was used. But of course, we have the horrific images of captivity of actual humans who are also subjected to this kind of treatment, which brings me to probably the most horrific use of branding. And again, this is where the emotional toll comes in as well, in which people were actually branded as well. This brand, I don't have time to tell you all about it, but this is the tangible evidence that we have of the British royal family's connections to slavery. This is a document that actually indicated how slaves were to be branded, how Africans were to be branded when they were enslaved, and then transported to the Caribbean. This is the South Seas Company brand here. S, reverse C, C, and reverse S there with the crown of St. Edward on the top. So for me, the poetry of Green Walters is profound. Here's a man who was born during slavery, likely was a slave himself, we don't know for sure, certainly was familiar with the yoke of slavery, chose to make his symbol a reflection of his hand on that idea of the yoke of slavery. Just astonishing. Very quickly, I will tell you that there is a connection here to that lovely Duke of York I mentioned, because the Duke of York, who became James the II, actually started the Royal African Company, and his brand is also mentioned in documents being placed on enslaved Africans as well. We don't have an actual image of the brand, but there are references to it made in several documents. It was DY that was made. And of course, the Royal African Company, 10 years later, helped to fund the Hudson's Bay Company, which then went and invested in fur trade and then had devastating consequences on Indigenous people in this continent as well. To kind of take us out of that negative stuff, I just want to draw your attention to this design of, it's a modern design of Green Walters brand. This was done by a designer that I discovered, Tosin, I don't mean I discovered her personally, but I came across her, Tosin Odubegmi. And I asked her what Green Walters brand might look like today, and she came up with this. Beautiful, I thought, beautiful. See, there are definitely some pluses that we can come up with. All right, so let's talk about forging a new language. So we know that Charles Dyson forged his own letters. I have taken this language and I have been composing poems using this idea. This one is called Some Say, and the title of it is very, very long. So I'll read the title and then you can see how I've borrowed John Ware's cattle brand, and I've made it a poem here. The title of the poem is Some Say They're Walking Sticks, Some Say They're Nines, some say 9 was his lucky number because it had something to do with slavery and freedom and some connection to the number 9. Some say he was born in Texas, and some say they're just walking sticks. That's the title of the poem there. The poem itself consists of the word unknown in the form of John Ware's brand, because research shows us we just don't know a lot of these things, okay? And that is very common. I used that shape in a number of poems, but I also have used the actual brands as well. So this is David Mills. Dave Mills is the son of Henry Mills, who was that Black ancestor who married a Guyana woman. And now there are people who live on the Guyana Reserve who still can trace their ancestry back to their African ancestor. So Dave's brand was simply DM. The title of this poem is Send Me a DM from the Past. Yeah, so using the cattle brand in that way. And I will just tell you that the ultimate goal of this poetic project is to take all of these brands and to construct an actual font with them. And I am doing that right now. I'm in the middle of creating a font. I have several letters that I've already created. It's really difficult. It takes a long time. But once I have got the font constructed, I will then use the construction to type out some of these poems that you've seen here, as well as to create some new poems as well. This is the first poem that I constructed using the actual font that I've made so far. As you can see, it's just called Boy, and it's just that's all it is. It's just Boy using the letters of these black cowboys. All right, listen, there's lots more that I could say, but I think that says everything right there. All right, I'm going to end the talk there. And I just want to remind you that we are going to be doing a prize giveaway. I don't know if we have time to do it right now, but if not, then we'll just have it done on the side. And then I think Paul or somebody will jump in and let you know who the actual winner of the books is. All right. So I will just thank you folks for your time and your willing attention. And we'll turn things over now to the Q&D, the discussion.
Incredible, Bertrand. Thank you. And everyone is joining me in putting their virtual emoji hands together for you. Just an amazing project that you're working on. Thank you so much. Everybody, please put your questions for Bertrand into the chat. We would like to have the chance for some of you to address questions. For those who are able to stay a few minutes longer, I know you might not all be able to, but I think Bertrand has offered to stay a little bit beyond 4 o'clock for people who might like to chat as well. Maybe while people are sort of collecting their thoughts and posting some questions, Joanna, what do you think? Are we able to run a quick randomizer?
Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Okay, what I can do is I will share my screen. I've thrown in all the names. Here we go.
I feel like we should have a drum roll, like seriously.
I can give you some fine print as the committee members will be ineligible for prizes.
All right, and we have our winner is Janelle B with a Janelle B at Athabasca U email address. So I will reach out afterwards and go from there.
Thanks so much, Joanna. Congratulations. That's wonderful. And just a reminder for everybody, AU Press is open access, so the ebook versions of their books are free for everybody online. Bertrand, I think I'm still waiting for questions to come in from the group. I'm sure everyone's pondering what you had to say. A question that I had, it's a book that you're envisioning, right, that's going to put this together. And those of us at the talk have sort of benefited from the explanation, the history, the research, and then to see even a brief glimpse of that poetry, I found quite powerful, having heard what's gone into it. When you present this as a book, are you planning to begin with a kind of essay or a personal narrative of what led up to this project and how it's been put together?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. So I don't actually know the answer to that. I do know that my poetry is invested enough in history that readers do benefit from a little extra bit of information, of guidance. I don't know if it'll be an essay or anything like that at the beginning. I do feel, though, that as you pointed out, the kind of emotional toll as well as the research difficulty should be made, people should be made aware of that, I think. Just because there are some of us who are doing this kind of work out there, academics, you all are like this, that it goes unrecognized. And it's hard. It's hard work, right? It's very rewarding. And many of us who are doing this work are kind of working in tandem, so we bounce off of each other. But I don't think people know the specifics of what goes into that. And the emotional things, certainly I do want people to be made aware of. I don't know if it'll be an essay, Paul, but I know there will be some sort of guidance to help people through, for sure. For example, I want people to use the font. So when I've completed it, I'm going to make it freely available, and I want people to use the font. So there will be instructions for that, certainly.
That's amazing. Thank you, Bertrand. Karina has posted a question. Bertrand, that picture from the Glenbow of Green Walters is labeled as a picture of Gung Mo. Do you think it's a mistake?
No, actually, I should have pointed this out when I was talking about the Green Walters. So I don't know who that photo is of. And I'm not sure that they do know at the Glenbow. If I'd had more time, I wanted to use this as an example of one more example of the lack of records that we have. So really that image just says it's a black man. I think the language is actually a colored man next to this wagon, blah blah blah, on the Bayou Ranch, and it's not actually 100% certain who it is. So I don't know if they're wrong, but I don't know that it is Green Walters, and I should have pointed that out.
No problem. We've got a couple more questions that we're going to pose to Bertrand, but I do realize that some people in the group might have to leave. And so I just want to take this chance, before anybody does have to leave, just to give one more big thank you. And please join me, everybody, with those emoji hands of yours, with a very big thank you for Bertrand. And for those of you who are able to stick around a little bit longer, please do so. Okay, Hugh Notman asks, do these cowboys have any living descendants in Alberta that we know of?
Okay, so that is part of the search that I am doing. And so far, I think I have found, well, one for sure, definitely. Okay, one for sure. And I'll get to that in a moment. But so far, I'm finding possible links. Again, it's very, very difficult because of how the records have not really been kept. The one for certain that we can say is that, as I pointed out, there are people who live on the Guyana Reserve who do recognize Henry Miller as their ancestor. Okay, and so Henry Mills, rather, came up through the U.S., probably a slave. Again, we're not too sure. Acted as a trapper, as a trader, and then he married a Guyana woman, had children. Those children ended up settling on the reserve and basically became indigenous in future generations. So those generations are there. The Mills name is still there on that reserve. And so, yes, that's the blatant answer. But as far as other examples are concerned, it's still a difficult task to find them. I think I'm close to one, I think, but again, very, very difficult. I actually am, believe it or not, like I have no time to spare. I actually am working on a podcast in which I am interviewing someone who might be a descendant of one of these people. Yeah. So we'll see. Watch this space. A great question.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and I'm hoping we'll be maybe receiving some updates on this throughout your residency. Lee says, your work is so important. I see social and ecological benefits that could be relevant for the future, not only the past. Can you speak to the future of Black cowboys? P.S. Love the font.
Yeah, okay. So I love that idea as well. And I think it is very important that we don't only think about history as being the discourse of the past. It's, of course, that's not what it is. It is about the present, and of course, it's about how we anticipate the future as well. One of the cowboys who I didn't actually put on there for you is relatively contemporary. He's a Jamerson, and Jamerson, for those of you who are familiar with the history of the Black Pioneers, that's one of the Black Pioneer family names. His son is not a cowboy himself, but is a part of maintaining the legacy of these Black pioneers. I feel as though it's important for us to recognize that we don't see many Black cowboys today because we believe that there were none in the past. And the more that we bring this past out, the more viable it will be for people to return to this sort of thing as well. So, for example, in the US, there are Black cowboy societies that are now regaining momentum. There's very famous Black rodeo that takes place in Boley, Oklahoma every year. I feel as though because rural people in general, but people who have to care for the land, farmers and ranchers, they do really care about animals, and they do care about ecology and things like that. I feel that if we can stop seeing Blackness as only tied to the cities, then there is a way forward for us to seeing in the future where these Black rural identities can express themselves, how they can legitimate themselves in the future, and expressively, or rather expressly. By that I mean purposefully. I think a little French got in the way there. purposefully connect them to the ecologies of the future as well. Excellent
Wonderful.
question, though. Yeah.
Really good question. Shauna says, thank you. We put the talk on a large screen in the library, and 3 of us were watching, 2 AU staff members and 1 community member. That's fantastic, Shauna. Thanks for doing that.
That is great. Yeah. It means you could see all of my greasy nose in the big screen in the library. That's so embarrassing. Oh.
Everybody, Bertrand is with us until June, and so I think we'll be hearing more about this project in the coming months. But again, Bertrand has kindly offered to join us here at AU as a resource for your own writing projects. So if you're connected to the AU community as a student, as a staff member, it doesn't matter what courses you're taking. If you're working on creative writing yourself, we put up the link. You can submit your work to Bertrand. There are guidelines for how to do that. And it's an incredible opportunity to get some feedback on your own writing. Bertrand, I just can't express my thanks enough. This has been just amazing. And I'm sure everyone will join me in saying thank you so much. And we can't wait to hear more. Thanks, Bertrand.
Super fun. I really appreciate the opportunity to do it. I really do. I'm so glad for those thoughtful questions as well. And I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.